He humiliated his housekeeper at a charity ball just because he discovered she listened to waltzes in secret. "If you dance with me, I'll marry you." The entire room laughed, but when the music began and she took her first step, silence took over everything, because no one there had any idea who she really was, or that this invisible woman carried a story powerful enough to change everything. There are people the world chooses not to see, not because they are small, but because the world is afraid of what it would find if it truly looked. This is the story of one of them. Sophia Reyes arrived at the Whitmore estate every morning at 6 o'clock, when the sun still hesitated over the Hudson River. She brought her grey uniform folded neatly in a canvas bag, her shoes clean though the left sole had been separating for weeks, and her earbuds coiled carefully at the very bottom of the bag, beneath everything else, the way you store something you don't want anyone to find. She was 30 years old, dark hair always pulled back, hands that were no longer soft, and a way of moving through the large cold rooms of that house that belonged to someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, to breathe without making noise, to exist without disturbing. The estate belonged to the Whitmore family, one of the most prominent names in American ballroom dance. Edward Whitmore had built the Whitmore Dance Academy 50 years ago with the conviction that excellence is non-negotiable and talent without pedigree does not exist. His son Alexander had grown up believing exactly the same, because when you grow up inside an idea large enough, you eventually mistake it for the truth. Alexander Whitmore was 36 years old, with the posture of someone who has never had to ask permission to enter any room, and the reputation of being the finest ballroom dancer the country had produced in a generation. The magazine said so. The sponsors repeated it. The trophies lined along the hallway of the second floor confirmed it, each one in its exact place like soldiers in formation. Alexander was cold, demanding, and completely certain that the world operated in one specific way: those who belong above and those who belong below. That boundary for him was as natural as gravity. Sophia belonged below. That was clear from her very first morning. The first time Alexander Whitmore spoke to her directly was on her third day. She was wiping down the baseboards in the east corridor when he came down the hallway without looking where he was going, nearly stepped on her cleaning bucket, and glanced down at it, the way one glances at an obstacle on a sidewalk. "The hallway should be done before 7, he said. "I started at 6, sir. There are 14 rooms on this floor." "Before 7, he repeated, and kept walking. Sophia watched him disappear around the corner. She counted to 5, then picked up her bucket and kept working. That was the beginning of a dynamic that had one rule. He gave orders, she fulfilled them, and neither of them existed for the other beyond that. Not cruelty with intention, something harder to bear, total indifference. And indifference hurts differently than cruelty, because cruelty at least acknowledges that you exist. What was not clear, and what Sophia was very careful to keep hidden, was what she stored in those earbuds. Every morning, somewhere between the first and second floor, while climbing the service stairs with her cleaning cart, she put the earbuds in for a moment. Just a moment. She closed her eyes and let the waltz in. Not just any waltz, always the same one. The Blue Danube, the same piece her mother, Rosa, used to play on the small record player in their apartment in Queens on Sunday afternoons, when the outside world could do whatever it wanted, because inside those 4 walls, with the worn wooden floor, the only things that existed were the music and the movement. Rosa Reyes had been a dancer, not the kind that appears in magazines, the real kind, the kind who learns because the music finds you before you know its name, the kind who dances in rooms with no mirrors and no applause, and yet does it with more truth than many who fill concert halls. She had taught Sophia from the time she could stand. She had told her every Sunday, in the same voice every time, "When you dance, baby, you show who you are without saying a single word. Never let anyone take that from you." Sophia had won a scholarship at 19, a real scholarship, the kind that changes the direction of a life. The National Academy of Contemporary Dance in New York City had selected her from among 200 candidates. The artistic director had told her she had something that couldn't be taught, that she was born already knowing. She lasted 3 months. When her mother died and her father, Roberto, began to get sick, Sophia packed her things, returned the scholarship with a 2-paragraph letter that took her 3 nights to write, and went home to Queens. There was no drama. There was no scene. Only a decision made in silence, like all the important decisions of her life. That was 11 years ago. Since then, she had worked at whatever was available: stores, restaurants, private homes. She came to the Whitmore estate 7 months ago through an agency. The pay was better than average, the rules were clear, and the work was demanding. Sophia was not afraid of work. She was afraid of the months when the money didn't stretch to cover her father's medication, and there were still 10 days left until the next paycheck. Roberto Reyes was 72 years old, with congestive heart failure that advanced with the cruel patience of diseases that don't kill quickly, but slowly. The cardiologist at St. Jacinto Medical Center had been direct the previous month. Without surgical intervention within 6 months, Roberto's heart would simply stop compensating. The procedure cost $160,000. Sophia earned $3,200 a month. The math didn't lie even though it hurt. So the earbuds were only a moment, a minute, maybe 2, on the stairs between the first and second floors when no one was watching. A reminder that she had been someone else before she became invisible. Then she coiled them back up, tucked them into the bottom of the bag, and kept climbing, until the Tuesday Alexander Whitmore found them. It wasn't on the stairs, it was in the service room on the second floor where Sophia had left her bag while cleaning the adjoining bathroom. Alexander passed by, saw the open bag, and saw the earbuds. He picked them up with the naturalness of someone who touches what they want, because everything in that house belongs to them. He connected them to his phone out of curiosity and listened. Waltz. The Blue Danube. He disconnected them. When Sophia came out of the bathroom with the scrub brush in her hand, Alexander was standing by the bag with the earbuds dangling from his fingers and an expression she took a moment to read. It was contempt, not simple contempt. The specific contempt of someone who has just found something they consider out of place. "Are these yours?" he asked, holding up the earbuds. "Yes, sir. I left them." "You listen to waltzes?" He said it as if asking whether she had found something strange in the garden. With that mixture of mockery and bewilderment that doesn't need volume to hurt. Sophia looked at him. "Yes." Alexander exhaled a small breath that wasn't exactly a laugh, but resembled one. "Waltzes," he repeated it, as if processing the incongruity of the thing. "A housekeeper. Waltzes. The Blue Danube. With respect, sir, they're my earbuds and my time. This is my home," he said, simply, without anger, with the calm of someone who doesn't need to raise their voice because they have never doubted they are right. "And in my home, staff don't use work time for personal entertainment." Sophia tightened her grip on the brush. "I was on my break. There are no breaks on the second floor between 8 and 11. He said it the way someone cites a rule that has always existed. He dropped the earbuds onto the bag. "And I would suggest you listen to genres more appropriate to your context." He walked down the hallway. His steps were those of someone who has never needed to hurry because the world always waits for him. Sophia said nothing. She put the earbuds in the bag, picked up the brush, and kept cleaning. But that evening, on the subway back to Queens, she pressed the bag against her chest with both hands and stared through the window for a long time without seeing anything. The days that followed were the same as before in shape, but different in weight. Alexander didn't speak to her about the earbuds, he didn't speak to her about anything, but there was something in the way he looked at her when they crossed paths in the hallways, a second longer than necessary, with an expression that wasn't exactly curiosity, but also wasn't the usual indifference, that Sophia noticed without naming it. The way you notice a shift in air pressure before a storm. The Whitmore Foundation's annual charity ball was held every November at the Grand Imperial Ballroom of the Harrington Hotel, a venue whose name was as imposing as its room rates. It was the most important social event of the cultural circle. 200 guests, a live chamber orchestra, a 10-course dinner, and as the centerpiece of the evening, a ballroom demonstration by Alexander Whitmore. It was sacred tradition. The expectation was part of the protocol. That year, Alexander would dance with Vanessa Cole, the most recognized dancer at the Whitmore Academy, a 2-time national champion. They had rehearsed for weeks. Everything was ready. The problem was that on the night of the ball, Sophia was called in as part of the additional service staff. The estate needed extra hands for the event, and the agency had assigned her without asking, the way things are assigned when you belong to the category of people who aren't asked. She arrived in a black uniform, tray in hand at 7 in the evening. The ballroom smelled of expensive flowers and cologne that cost more than she earned in a month. She circulated among the guests with that professional invisibility the work required, present without being present, seeing without looking, hearing without listening. Alexander stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the kind of people who naturally orbit around money and last names. He wore a dark suit that probably had its own name, and his usual posture, the one that said he was the fixed point around which everything else revolved. Victoria Harrington was at his side, 23 years old, daughter of a Boston family with the same specific gravity as the Whitmores, dressed in midnight silk with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Sophia passed nearby with the tray. She didn't look at them. It was in the second hour of the evening that everything changed. The exact moment was this. Sophia approached to serve champagne to a group near where Alexander was standing, and one of the guests, a man of about 50 with the easy confidence of someone who has drunk enough to say what he thinks, gestured toward the tray and said something low that made the group laugh. The kind of laughter that doesn't need explanation, because everyone understands who it's at the expense of. Rodrigo saw them laugh, saw Sophia standing there with the tray. And something, perhaps the champagne, perhaps the boredom, perhaps that dark impulse belonging to those who have never faced the consequences of their words, led him to do what he did next. He walked toward her, in front of everyone. You. He pointed at her with the glass in his hand, without using her name because he had never bothered to learn it. You listen to waltzes, don't you? Sophia went still. Mr. Whitmore. She listens to waltzes, he repeated, now addressing the group around him with the tone of someone sharing an amusing anecdote. Found her with her earbuds in on the second floor. The Blue Danube. He paused for effect. Some people were already smiling. Can you actually dance or do you just listen? The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for Sophia to understand what was happening. I didn't come here to dance, sir, she said, voice controlled. I came to work. Alexander smiled, the smile of someone who holds all the cards and knows it. What a shame. He turned to the group. Then, as if the idea had just occurred to him, though Sophia understood later it was anything but, he raised his glass and said, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear, if you dance this piece with me, I'll marry you. The silence lasted 1 second. Then the ballroom laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, the kind that spreads from table to table like a wave nobody planned. Someone near the bar said something Sophia couldn't hear, but the people around him could, and they laughed harder. A woman in a red dress covered her mouth. A man in the back actually turned to look at Sophia the way people turn to look at someone who has stumbled on a stage. Come on, darling, show us what you've got, called a voice from somewhere in the crowd. More laughter. Sophia felt the heat of 200 looks, not just the weight of them, the heat, the kind that starts at the collar and moves up, the kind you feel when you understand you have become the entertainment for the evening without consenting to it. She held the tray with both hands. She did not move her face. Victoria Harrington didn't laugh. She only lowered her eyes toward her glass. Catherine Whitmore, seated at the central table beside Edward, watched the scene with the face of someone who recognizes the exact moment a situation has slipped out of control, but decides not to intervene because the damage is already done. And then something happened inside Sophia. It wasn't a heroic decision. It wasn't the kind of bravery that appears in movies. It was simpler and deeper than that. It was her mother's voice. When you dance, baby, you show who you are without saying a single word. Never let anyone take that from you. Sophia set the tray on the nearest table. Slowly, with a calm the ballroom did not expect. She removed the small apron from her uniform, folded it carefully, set it beside the tray, and then walked to the dance floor. The noise of the ballroom faded, not all at once. Gradually, the way you lower the volume of something without realizing you're doing it, until it's already silent. Alexander watched her approach, and something crossed his expression. It wasn't what he expected. He had launched the bet the way you throw a stone into a lake, for the pleasure of seeing the impact. And now the lake was walking toward him, with a calm that didn't fit the script he had imagined. Sophia stopped in front of him at the center of the floor. She looked at him directly. No defiance in her eyes, no fear either. Something far more complicated, the serenity of someone who no longer has anything to lose in that room. All right, she said. Alexander opened his mouth slightly, closed it. The orchestra, which had been on pause, received a signal from the conductor, no one knew from whom, and began. The Strauss waltz, the Blue Danube, the same music that played in her earbuds, the same music of the Sundays in Queens, the same music she had kept tucked at the very bottom of her bag beneath everything else. Now it played in a ballroom with 200 people and a 20-piece orchestra, and Sophia Reyes, in her black housekeeper's uniform and shoes that weren't made for dancing, extended her arm toward Alexander Whitmore with the exact perfect posture of someone who has made that gesture thousands of times. Alexander took her hand, and the music took them both. What happened in the next 4 minutes was something none of those present at the Grand Imperial Ballroom that evening would forget easily. Some described it afterward as if they had witnessed something they couldn't name. Others kept it to themselves, because there are experiences that shrink when you put them into words, and it's better not to risk it. It wasn't the technique that stopped the room, though the technique was there, impressive and natural at the same time, as if Sophia's body had preserved 11 years of absence in a state of perfect suspension and was now waking all at once. It was something else. The way her expression changed at the first measure, like a door that had been closed for a long time opening suddenly inward, her spine aligned, her neck lengthened, her shoulders fell back with an ease that isn't born in dance studios, but in humble rooms where no one watches you, and so you can be completely yourself. She closed her eyes for one instant, only one instant, and when she opened them, there was something in them the ballroom hadn't seen all evening. Truth, she wasn't dancing for them, she was dancing for her mother, and that was visible in every inch of her body. Alexander felt it from the very first measure. He had been dancing for 20 years. He had shared the floor with world champions, with dancers who had perfected their technique in the finest academies in Europe. He knew exactly what to expect from a partner, how to read her, how to anticipate her movements, how to compensate for her mistakes. None of that had prepared him for this, because Sophia wasn't following. She was speaking. Every movement was a sentence. Every turn was a word expressed in a way that pure technique can never imitate, because technique is the form, and this was the content. And the content was so real, so loaded with something he couldn't name but recognized somewhere deep inside himself, that in the second minute of the piece, Alexander Whitmore, the finest dancer of his generation, the man who never lost control of the floor, found himself following her, not the other way around, her. Something broke inside him in that moment. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone could see from the outside, but in that quiet way something breaks when you believed it was solid, and it turns out it was glass. When the music ended, the ballroom held silence. 4 seconds. 5. Then the applause began, and it wasn't the polite applause Alexander knew, the cultivated clapping of cultural circles who applaud because it's expected. It was the other kind, the kind that comes from a place education doesn't control. Someone stood in the back, then another person, then 5, then the entire room. Alexander released Sophia's hand. He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking towards some point that wasn't in that ballroom, her eyes bright in a way that could have had 10 different explanations, and probably all of them were true at the same time. Then she picked up her apron from the table, put it back on, took the tray, and continued serving champagne as if nothing had happened. Alexander didn't move from the center of the floor for 30 seconds. No one approached to speak to him, perhaps because something in his expression stopped them, perhaps because everyone sensed he was processing something, and it was better to leave him alone. Victoria Harrington watched him from across the room. The way she watched him, with a mixture of understanding and sadness that was too composed to be spontaneous, said that she already knew or suspected what had just begun. That night Alexander didn't sleep well. It wasn't something he allowed himself to acknowledge out loud, or even to himself. But at 3 in the morning he was still awake with the image of that woman on the floor, and what disturbed him most wasn't the technique or the elegance, but that thing he couldn't name that had hit him in the chest, like an unexpected diagnosis. The days that followed he spent investigating. It wasn't difficult. The agency had the records. Sophia Reyes's story wasn't hidden, because no one had ever bothered to look for it. Scholarship at 19, National Academy of Contemporary Dance in New York, selected from 200 candidates. Withdrawal 3 months later for family reasons. Mother deceased, father ill, 11 years of service work. Alexander read the file 3 times, then he closed it and stared at his desk for a long time. He had been the one to judge her, who had picked up her earbuds with that dismissive gesture of someone finding something out of place, who had said with the comfortable certainty of someone who has never had to justify themselves that she should listen to genres more appropriate to her context, and she had danced Strauss in a luxury ballroom with work shoes and left him in silence. The following Monday, Alexander summoned Sophia to his office. She arrived punctually in her work uniform, hands clasped in front of her in that gesture of someone accustomed to waiting for news that isn't always good. "Sit down," said Alexander. Sophia sat. She looked at him without lowering her gaze. He noticed that too. "I have a performance at the Grand Arts Forum in 6 weeks. It's the most important event of the year for the Academy." He spoke with the economy of someone unaccustomed to giving more explanation than necessary. My regular partner had an accident. She won't be ready in time. Sophia said nothing. She waited. I want you to train with me. Silence. No, said Sophia. Alexander looked at her. The answer surprised him, though he didn't quite let it show. Excuse me? No. She said it with the same calm with which she had said everything else since she'd known him. No aggression, no apology. You humiliated me in front of 200 people 4 days ago. I'm not going to train with you. Alexander pressed his hands together on the desk. He considered her words for a moment longer than he would have wanted. It was a lapse in judgment, he said finally. Yes. Sophia nodded slightly. It was. Another silence. This time, it was him who held it with more difficulty. I'm offering you $15,000 for the 6 weeks of rehearsal and the performance. Sophia didn't respond immediately. Alexander saw something pass across her expression, quickly, that she controlled before it reached the surface. But he saw it. I don't need... Your father needs surgery. He said it without softening the phrase because that wasn't his style. I know because I looked into it. The procedure he needs costs more than you can put together in the time you have. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Heavier, with something inside it that hurt. Sophia looked at him. Her eyes had a clarity that was unsettling. You investigated my life. I investigated who I'd be working with. I hadn't said yes. Not yet. Sophia sat quietly for several seconds. Alexander didn't fill that silence. He let it be, which was the only intelligent thing he had done in that conversation. She thought about her father, about the monitor that beeped all night in the hospital room, about the doctor who spoke to her with the tone of someone who has had that conversation too many times, about the overdue bills on the kitchen table, about her mother's ring she had almost sold 2 weeks ago. There are conditions, she said. Alexander raised his eyebrows slightly. That was his version of surprise. What happened at the ball doesn't happen again. I'm not your joke or your social experiment. We rehearse, we perform, and then everyone goes their separate ways. She paused. And if you disrespect me at any point, I leave. Without negotiation. Alexander looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Agreed. When do we start? Wednesday, 7 in the evening. Sophia stood. She was almost at the door when Alexander spoke again. Why did you give it up? He asked. The scholarship. She stopped but didn't turn around, because it was what had to be done, and she left. Wednesday she arrived exactly on time at the second-floor studio. Alexander was already there in rehearsal clothes, in front of the mirrors, with the closed concentration of someone who has spent decades turning dance into work. He looked at her when she entered, glanced at her clothes, black pants, simple shirt, flat-soled shoes not made for dancing, and said without preamble, You need proper rehearsal clothes. I don't have any. There will be something in the service room by Thursday. Sophia opened her mouth to say something, closed it. Fine. They began. The first days were a constant negotiation disguised as rehearsal. Alexander directed with the surgical precision of someone with 2 decades in this. Elbow up, hips back, weight forward. Again. Sophia followed each instruction with a discipline that surprised him, though he didn't say so. But she also pushed back when she was right, and that was something he didn't expect from anyone in that studio. The first time came in the second rehearsal. You're overleading, said Sophia. Alexander looked at her. What? You're signaling every step before I get there. The partner feels it and loses naturalness. You have to trust that I'll be there. The silence that followed was tense in a specific way. Not because she was wrong, because she was right and they both knew it. Again, he said. They continued, and this time he held back the impulse to anticipate. The difference was immediate, small but real. Thursday, the bag of rehearsal clothes appeared in the service room, her exact size. Sophia took it with both hands, held it for a moment, felt something complicated she didn't want to examine too closely. She wore it. She didn't say thank you, and he didn't wait for it. It was part of the arrangement. The most important conflict came in the second week, when they were running through the central section of the choreography. Alexander corrected her 4 times in a row at the same point. The 4th time, Sophia stopped. It's not the movement, she said. Excuse me. The problem isn't the movement, it's what comes before it. She took position alone and executed the sequence. It wasn't what he had taught her. It was something different, more organic, with a pause at the exact point where the music breathes before it resolves. And it was better, noticeably better. Alexander watched her with an attention that went beyond the technical. Again, he said. She repeated it. And this time, without planning to, he took a step forward. Just one. He stopped himself. Sophia saw that step but said nothing. She simply held the position and waited. "Good," he said finally, and modified the choreography without announcing it or commenting on it. Sophia suppressed a smile as she returned to starting position. It was Marie, who had been at the estate for 5 years, who spoke to her during the break that week while they had coffee in the kitchen. "Did anyone ever tell you about Vanessa Cole? Before this Vanessa, I mean the one from 7 years ago." Sophia shook her head. "His partner from back then, international level, brilliant. They were almost engaged." Marie stirred her coffee, even though there was no more sugar. She left him, said living with him was like living in a beautiful empty room, that he only really existed when he was dancing. Sophia didn't respond. She drank her coffee and stared at the bottom of the cup as if there was something to read there. That same afternoon, climbing toward the studio, she crossed paths with Alexander in the hallway. He was coming from a call, distracted, and when he saw her he made a small gesture of pause, as if about to say something. His eyes rested on hers a second longer than casual. Then he kept walking without saying anything. Sophia went up to the studio, changed, waited. He arrived 7 minutes late, the first time since they started. He gave no explanation, she didn't ask. But that interrupted gesture in the hallway, that phrase that never became a phrase, floated between them throughout the entire rehearsal that evening like something unresolved. The Wednesday of the 3rd week, Victoria Harrington entered the studio unannounced. She arrived during rehearsal, with the territorial confidence of someone who has never needed to knock before entering any room. Cream cashmere, hair loose. She stood by the door while Alexander and Sophia finished a sequence. When the music stopped, she applauded lightly with her fingertips. "Charming," she said, with a tone that did exactly the opposite of what the word meant. "Victoria," Alexander looked at her with his usual neutrality, "we didn't have plans tonight." "I know." Her eyes moved from him to Sophia with the speed of someone taking inventory and already done counting. "What's your name?" she asked directly. "Sophia Reyes." Victoria smiled, a perfectly constructed smile. "Alexander speaks well of your progress." The pause that followed was brief, but deliberate. "It's admirable that someone in your position found this space." Sophia felt the edge of those words in exactly the place they were aimed. She didn't blink. "And it's admirable that someone in yours doesn't have a better way to spend a Wednesday evening." The silence that fell changed the temperature of the room. Alexander glanced at Sophia, briefly, with an expression that wasn't disapproval. It resembled quite the opposite. Victoria left 15 minutes later with the same elegance with which she had arrived, but before crossing the door, she stopped. She turned toward Alexander with a calm that was more dangerous than anger. "Thursday I'm having dinner with your mother," she said, simply, like someone mentioning the weather, and she left. Alexander was quiet for a moment. Sophia, too. They both understood exactly what that sentence meant, and neither of them said it out loud. What followed was predictable in form, but not in intensity. Friday morning, Catherine Whitmore called Alexander to the formal sitting room. Marie, who had a gift for being nearby when important conversations happened, heard enough to tell Sophia that afternoon. Victoria had arrived at Thursday's dinner with information. Not invented, real. She had spoken with people in the circle who had been at the Grand Imperial Ballroom the night of the ball, people whose opinions carried weight in the world where the Whitmores lived. The conclusion was formulated with the precision of someone who knows exactly which words to use. Bringing a housekeeper onto the stage of the Grand Arts Forum wouldn't just be an image problem. It would be a statement. And statements have consequences for sponsors, for the families who send their children to the academy, for the name Edward Whitmore had built over 50 years. Catherine had listened to all of it, and Friday morning she had laid it out in front of her son. "Adriana Mills is available," said Catherine Whitmore. "I called her this morning. She would agree to rehearse with you." "I already have a partner," said Alexander. "Alexander." Catherine's voice had that specific calm that was harder to resist than anger. "This academy has 50 years of reputation. What happened at the Imperial Ballroom was a moment, one night. The Grand Arts Forum is something else. I know that perfectly. Then you understand that Victoria is right to be concerned, that we are right to be concerned." "What I understand," said Alexander, in a voice Marie would later describe as the calmest she had ever heard from him, "is that I have spent 2 decades doing what this family considers correct for the academy, for the name, for the image. In this, I decide." Catherine didn't respond. The way she didn't respond contained everything she would have said. But Victoria didn't stop there. 3 days later, on a Monday afternoon, Sophia was heading down the service stairs when she found Victoria in the hallway of the first floor. It wasn't a casual encounter. Victoria had been waiting for her. She stood by the window with a cup of tea in her hand, with the posture of someone who arrived early to a meeting only she knew was going to happen. "A moment," said Victoria as Sophia passed. Sophia stopped, looked at her. Victoria wasn't smiling this time. Her expression was different from the studio, more direct, less calculated, as if she had decided the word games were no longer necessary. "I know what you're thinking," said Victoria, "that I'm the jealous woman protecting her territory." She paused. "I'm not asking you to leave for my sake." Another silence, shorter. "I'm telling you that the world Alexander lives in has rules that don't disappear because the two of you dance well together. His family, the academy, the sponsors, 50 years of expectations." She lowered her voice slightly. "I grew up in that world. I know exactly how heavy it is, and I know what happens to people who enter it without understanding the weight." Sophia looked at her for a long moment. "Are you warning me or threatening me?" Victoria considered the question honestly. "Both," she said finally. "Depends on the day." And she walked down the hallway with her usual composure, leaving Sophia standing by the window, with something that wasn't exactly fear, but resembled it more than she would have liked to admit. That evening at rehearsal, Sophia arrived quieter than usual. Alexander noticed. He didn't ask. But during the central section, when the pause arrived, he sought her eyes with an attention that went beyond the technical, as if making sure she was still there. Alexander arrived at the next day's rehearsal, carrying a weight that hadn't been there the evening before. Sophia noticed the moment she entered the studio. Shoulders slightly more closed, jaw subtly set, eyes fixed on the mirrors with that hardness from the early days. They began in silence. The first half hour was pure technique, dry corrections, little music, none of the small moments that had become natural between them over the previous weeks. As if someone had returned to the studio an earlier version of Alexander Whitmore and taken away the one Sophia had learned to recognize. On the third exercise, when she adjusted the angle of her arm on her own initiative, he said without looking at her, "Here you do what I indicate, not what you decide." The studio went silent. Sophia looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse, disappointment. Then she walked to her bag in the corner of the studio and began putting her things away. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Leaving." She said it without drama, without tears, with the same calm with which she had set the champagne tray on the table that night at the ball. "I really don't belong in your world, Alexander. I never will, and that's fine." She closed the bag. "But I'm not staying somewhere I'm being treated the way I was at the beginning." Alexander didn't respond. He stood in the center of the studio, watching her. Sophia walked to the door, put her hand on the knob, and then she heard the music, the Blue Danube, soft from the sound system in the corner, started by him without a single word. She went still with her hand on the knob. Alexander was in the center of the studio, facing the mirrors, one arm raised and the other extended to the side. The exact starting position of the Viennese waltz, alone, asking for nothing, explaining nothing, only waiting, like someone who knows they have no right to demand anything, but still cannot give up. Sophia looked at him through the mirror, at this man who had picked up her earbuds with contempt, and now it was he who had put on the music. She released the knob. She walked to the center of the studio, took her position beside him, and they danced, without speaking, without looking at each other directly. Only the music and the movement and everything both of them knew, and neither had yet said. When the music ended, Alexander said without turning around, "What I said before was wrong." "Yes," said Sophia. "It was wrong. A silence, different from all the previous ones." "Shall we continue?" he asked. "We continue." Edward Whitmore stopped Alexander in the hallway that same week. "Your mother is worried," he said, with no preamble. "I know. I would be too." He paused. "But I watched her dance at the Imperial Ballroom." Another pause, longer. "Keep going." And he left. Nothing more. No warmth, no enthusiasm, but with the solidity of someone who has taken a position. In the Whitmores, that was support. That evening, Alexander arrived at the studio before Sophia. He waited by the window. When he heard her footsteps on the stairs, something in his chest settled in a way he preferred not to analyze too carefully. Sophia came in. She saw his posture, less rigid than usual, looking toward the window instead of toward the mirrors, and paused for a moment in the doorway. "Your father?" he asked without turning. The question took her by surprise. It was the second time he had asked, and each time it caught her the same way. "Stable, the surgery is still scheduled." Alexander nodded, then went to the floor. "I want to work the ending. I need you to tell me what you feel in the final turn before the close." Sophia looked at him. "What I feel?" "Yes, not what you see in the mirror, what you feel inside." The question was so unusual from him that it took her a moment to respond. She studied him, searched his expression for something that would tell her whether it was a technical question or something else. She didn't find a clear answer, or maybe she found both at the same time. "I feel," she said slowly, "that at that point in the music, we're both carrying something we haven't finished saying, and the waltz gives us exactly one more measure to say it before it's too late." Alexander looked at her for longer than any pause they had shared before. Sophia didn't look away. Though something trembled slightly in her fingers, she pressed them against her side. "Show me," he said. They were the longest rehearsals of all the weeks, but when they finished, near 11 at night, the ending of the choreography had something it had never had before. It was true. And while they turned off the studio lights, without saying so, they both knew it. The phone call from the doctor came the Monday of the 5th week. The specialist at St. Jacinto Medical Center confirmed that Roberto's surgery was scheduled for 2 weeks out, that the money from Alexander's first payment had covered what was still needed, that the prognosis was favorable if everything went well during the procedure. Sophia took the call standing in the hallway of the estate, by the window looking out over the garden. When she hung up, she didn't cry. She had learned not to cry where anyone might see her, but she stood 5 minutes looking at the rose bushes, eyes bright and breathing slower than usual, like someone who has been holding their breath for a long time and can finally let it out. That evening at rehearsal, from the very first measure, Alexander noticed, Sophia danced differently, not better in technical terms, different in something harder to measure, as if a weight she had been carrying in her body without knowing it was suddenly gone. And in the pause of the central section, the emotional charge was such that Alexander lost the rhythm for the first time since he was 14 years old. They stopped. "What happened?" she asked. He didn't respond immediately. He was looking at her with an attention impossible to disguise as technical. There was something in his expression Sophia hadn't seen before, something resembling not knowing what to do with what he was feeling, something resembling being seen. "Nothing," he said. "Let's keep going." But that evening, after Sophia left, Alexander stayed in the dark studio for almost an hour, sitting on the wooden floor with his back against the bar and the music off. The garden lights came through the windows in long, quiet lines. He thought about what Vanessa had told him 7 years ago before she left, that living with him was like being in an empty room with beautiful furniture, that he only really existed when he was dancing. He thought about Sophia, about the way she had set the champagne tray on the table that night at the Imperial Ballroom, the calm of that gesture, what he had seen in her face when the music started, and she closed her eyes and opened them again. He stayed there until the garden lights shut off automatically at midnight. It was the first time in years he had remained in that room doing nothing. The night of the performance at the Grand Arts Forum arrived with the implacable punctuality of dates one waits for, with a mixture of longing and dread. The forum held 400 people, and that evening it was full to the last seat. In the front center row, Edward and Catherine Whitmore, with the posture of those who know they are being watched and have decided to use that to their advantage. Beside them, Adriana Mills, the dancer Catherine had proposed as a replacement, invited as a gesture of courtesy or perhaps of pressure, depending on how one read it. And Victoria Harrington, in a deep burgundy gown, eyes fixed on the empty stage, and that expression mixing expectation with a resignation too composed to be spontaneous. Backstage, Sophia stood by the black curtain in the deep blue dress the Academy's team had prepared, hands clasped before her in that gesture that wasn't quite praying but resembled it. Her heart beat faster than she wanted, and she could hear it clearly in the silence of the wings. She thought about Victoria's words in the hallway, about the weight she had described, about 50 years of the Whitmore name, about everything that lay between that curtain and the stage that wasn't merely physical distance. She felt Alexander approach before she saw him. Something in the air shifted when he arrived, and that no longer surprised her. He stopped beside her, a moment of silence. "Are you ready?" Sophia didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the stage from behind the curtain, the lights, the 400 people, the front row with the Whitmores and the woman who should have been in her place. She felt the weight of all of it in her chest, real and concrete, like something physical. "I'm afraid," she said. She said it without thinking. It simply came out. Alexander looked at her from the side. "I know. I feel like I don't belong out there." "What you feel and what is true are different things." A brief pause. "You taught me that." Sophia looked at him, and in his expression, for the first time in weeks of being near each other without fully seeing, she found something without armor, something not being controlled or managed, something simply present. "Sophia." His voice was different, lower, the kind of voice used when there's no script. "What happened these past months? The rehearsals, what you said about the waltz and what partners carry without saying before it's too late." A real pause, from someone searching for words they don't use often. It wasn't only the music. Sophia looked at him for 4 seconds. 5. She felt the warmth rise but didn't fight it. "No," she said, "not for me either." Alexander extended his hand toward her, not as at the start of every rehearsal, with the director's technical precision to his partner, with something else, with the same thing that was in his voice. Sophia took it, and in that contact, before the music began, before they walked onto the stage, she knew that what was coming was not only a performance. The music began, they entered together, and the house received them with that expectant silence that great stages hold for moments that don't yet know they are going to matter. From the very first measure, something was different from all the rehearsals. Not in the technique, which was perfect, in something else that has no technical name, but which the 4 musicians in the first row of the orchestra noticed and would remember years later when anyone asked them about the finest evenings they had lived in that forum. It was real. What they were dancing was real, not a demonstration, a conversation that had been happening for weeks and now had music. Catherine Whitmore in the front row did not applaud during the piece. She was too still, but at the exact point where the pause of the central section arrived, the pause that had taken weeks to understand and now was the heart of the entire choreography, her hands resting in her lap opened and closed their fingers once. Edward looked at her from the corner of his eye. She didn't look at him. Adriana Mills, 3 seats away, watched the stage with the precise attention of someone who knows exactly what they are seeing. Her expression wasn't envy, but recognition. The kind of recognition that can only come from someone who truly understands what this is about. On the stage, the pause arrived, and it was exactly what Sophia had said it was, the moment before something is said, charged with everything that hasn't been said yet. Both bodies in tension forward. Alexander's eyes on Sophia's, without the technical distance of a director looking at his partner, with the gaze of someone who has finally stopped being afraid of what they would find if they truly looked. And Sophia held it, without looking away, without protecting herself, with the quiet courage she had always had, the kind no one had seen because no one had bothered to look for it. The final measure was a long, slow turn that resolved everything the music had promised. When they stopped in the final position, his hand on her back, their bodies slightly inclined toward each other, the Grand Arts Forum held silence for 3 full seconds. Then the applause began. Someone stood in the 4th row, then 3 more people, then 10. Then the entire forum was on its feet, and the sound filled the space in a way that the artistic director of the Academy, a 62-year-old man who had seen hundreds of performances on that stage, would later describe as the kind you don't expect, and so they last. A woman in the 3rd row turned to her companion and asked loudly enough, "Who is she?" Edward Whitmore heard the question. He looked at his wife. Catherine had her eyes fixed on the stage. Her expression was that of someone processing something that changes a conviction she believed immovable. She took a moment to respond, and when she did, it was in a low voice, almost to herself, with something in her voice that had been absent for a long time. "She's the finest partner he's had in 20 years. It wasn't a welcome, but it was the truth." And in the Whitmore world, truth spoken aloud was worth more than most welcomes. Alexander and Sophia left the stage amid applause and the pleasant chaos of the wings. Congratulations, photographers, assistants. They walked together toward the dressing rooms without speaking, because after what had happened on the stage, words required more care than usual. It was Alexander who stopped first in the hallway. "Sophia," she turned. He stood without his usual perfect posture, without the armor. There was something in his face she had never seen before, or perhaps had seen once in the dark studio at the estate, when he had put the music on and stood alone waiting in the center of the floor. "I know the agreement was clear," he said. "We rehearse, we perform, everyone goes their separate way." A pause. But I can't go back to my separate way without telling you that what happened these months wasn't in the agreement. For me. Another pause, shorter, harder. And I don't know if it will be in yours. Sophia looked at him for what seemed a long time. 11 years ago, she said, I left dance because it was what had to be done, and I don't regret it. A pause. But there are things you carry for a long time because you can't find anywhere to put them. A shorter pause. You asked me what I feel, not what's convenient. So I'll tell you what I feel. Alexander waited. That this wasn't in my agreement either, said Sophia. And I'm glad. Alexander exhaled. So slight it was barely visible, like someone who has been holding their breath for a long time. Then he smiled. A smile that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth, the kind that makes it obvious that face was designed to smile that way far more often, and had spent too much time without doing so. Sophia felt that warmth in her chest. This time she didn't fight it. Can I take you to dinner? He asked. Tonight? Tonight. Sophia thought about her uniform folded in the bag, about the shoes that weren't made for dancing, about her mother's ring she hadn't had to sell, about her father with surgery scheduled and a doctor who returned calls. Yes, she said. They went out the side door of the forum, the one that opened onto the small street in the back where the sound technicians smoked and the assistants waited for cars. No one saw them leave, or perhaps they did, and simply decided it was the right scene and there was no need to interrupt. The conversation with the Whitmore family came the following Sunday. This time Alexander didn't wait to be summoned. He arrived in the morning, sat down in front of his parents and Victoria, whom he had invited himself because he believed important conversations should be complete, and spoke with the direct clarity that was, at bottom, the most authentic thing about him. He told them he had made a decision, that it was not subject to family approval, and that he said so with respect but with firmness, that Sophia Reyes was a person with an honesty and a capability he genuinely admired, that what was happening between them was a choice both were making with open eyes about all the complications, and that he hoped his family would have the generosity to know her before judging her. Edward listened with his hands clasped on the table. When Alexander finished, he was silent for several seconds. I watched her dance, he said finally. He added nothing, but the way he said it carried the weight of someone who has closed an internal argument that had been open for days. Catherine looked at her son for a long moment. Then, with something in her voice that had been stored somewhere for years, somewhere a once dancer keeps the things that time doesn't fully erase, she said, "Bring her next Sunday." It wasn't an embrace, but it was a door, and doors are what you need first. Victoria stayed alone with Alexander when his parents left. What followed was one of those conversations that hurt because they are necessary and are necessary precisely because they hurt. "Since when?" she asked. "I don't know when it started. I do know it's real." Victoria looked at him with that mixture of wounded pride and reluctant understanding that is one of the hardest emotions to sustain. "Do you know what bothers me most? That I'm not surprised." She picked up her bag. "You've been dancing with me at family events for 2 years, and you never looked at me the way you looked at her when the pause came at the forum." She stopped by the door. "Take care of her, she deserves it." And she left, without drama, with a dignity Alexander respected in silence. Roberto Reyes came out of surgery with the stubborn vitality of men who have promised not to leave just yet. Sophia sat in the waiting room for 6 hours with a book closed on her lap. When the surgeon came out and told her everything had gone well, she sat still for 4 seconds and then said, "Thank you," in a voice so small it was barely audible, but it was probably the largest word she had said in a very long time. Alexander arrived during visiting hours. Sophia hadn't told him to come, but there he was, in clothes that for the first time were neither black nor athletic but simply normal, with the quiet expression of someone who wants to be somewhere because they want to be there, with no more argument than that. They went in together. Roberto looked at them, first at one, then the other, then back to the first, with those old sharp eyes that don't miss anything. "You're the one who dances?" he asked Alexander. "Yes." "The one who humiliated her at that fancy party?" Alexander didn't blink. "Yes." Roberto looked at him for a moment, that carried the weight of several moments together, then nodded with the head movement of a man who has made an important decision and doesn't need more time to confirm it. "Sit down." Alexander sat. "My daughter told me you asked her what she felt when she danced." The old man looked at him directly. "Do you know how many people have asked her that in her life?" "No, nobody." A pause. "That tells me something about you." Another pause. I don't know yet whether it's good or whether you took too long to learn to ask, but it tells me something. Alexander didn't respond. He held the gaze. My Sophia, said Roberto, with a voice that had the texture of someone speaking about something they love and at the same time respect, has spent 11 years putting herself last. First her mother, then me. Always her at the end. A long pause. If you come into her life, you come in with the intention that she is first. Not when it's convenient, always. Understood, said Alexander. Don't say understood. Do it. A silence. Then Alexander said, with a simplicity that cost him more than any speech, I'm going to try every single day. Roberto looked at him a moment longer, then picked up the detective novel on his lap and opened it, which was his way of ending a conversation in exactly the right amount of time. Good. Now leave us alone. I have things to ask my daughter. Alexander went out into the hallway. He leaned his back against the wall. From inside came Roberto's low voice, and then Sophia's answer. And then, after a moment, her laugh, a full laugh without reservation, the kind one keeps only for the places where one feels completely safe. Alexander closed his eyes for 1 second. He had something in his chest that he couldn't describe with precision, but that felt strangely like being exactly where he was supposed to be. The months that followed had the texture of real things, imperfect, demanding, with their own small and large difficulties. Catherine Whitmore and Sophia had 3 uncomfortable conversations before having one that wasn't. Edward took longer, but the Whitmores were slow to change and quick to honor what they decided. When he finally extended his hand to Sophia at a family dinner in December, he did so with the solidity of a decision made to last. The Whitmore Academy offered Sophia a formal training program. She accepted with one condition. She would keep working, in a different context, but working, because independence was what her mother had taught her, and it was not negotiable. Alexander didn't object. He understood that was exactly the kind of woman she was, and that kind of woman was exactly what he needed to stop being the man in the empty room with beautiful furniture. There was a night in February, months after the Grand Arts Forum, when they danced alone in the second-floor studio. It wasn't a rehearsal. There was no choreography. Only music, an old waltz neither of them consciously chose but both recognized, and the almost complete darkness of the studio, with the garden lights coming through the windows in long, quiet lines. At the point where the pause of the central section would have arrived, Alexander stopped. Sophia looked at him. There's something I haven't finished saying. Say it. That before you came to this studio to clean the mirrors, I had spent years dancing perfectly without understanding why. He looked at her without armor, without distance, with the gaze that had taken weeks to appear and was now simply him. Now I know. Sophia raised her hand toward him, a hand that had carried trays, scrubbed floors, held her father's hand in hospital rooms, coiled earbuds at the very bottom of a bag beneath everything else, and placed it on his cheek with the same naturalness with which she placed her first step of a waltz, as if the floor belonged to her. Alexander closed his eyes for 1 instant, just 1 instant, holding something that mattered. Mom was right, said Sophia. When you dance, you show who you are without saying a single word. And who am I? Sophia smiled, the full smile, the one she kept only for the places where she felt completely safe. Someone who finally learned to ask what the other person feels, she said. The music continued, and so did they. Somewhere in the city, in a small apartment in Queens, in a building where the record player only worked if you gave it a soft tap on the left side, the memory of a woman who taught her daughter to waltz on Sunday afternoons persisted in the way that daughter held her posture, in how she let the music in before her feet began to move, in the way she danced, as if each measure were an opportunity to say something true. When you dance, baby, you show who you are without saying a single word. Never let anyone take that from you. No one had taken it from her. And that night, in a studio full of mirrors reflecting 2 people who had taken exactly the right amount of time to find each other, Sophia Reyes and Alexander Whitmore danced, without an audience, without a stage, without applause, just the 2 of them, and it was enough. It was, in fact, everything. If this story reached your heart, moved something inside you, or simply kept you company for a while, leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your opinion builds this channel and tells me which stories deserve to keep being told. What would you give this story?